Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. Debunking Atheism, Volume 12. In this video, I'm going to go over one particular atheistic objection to the existence of God. It's essentially an atheistic attack on the doctrine of divine simplicity. The doctrine of divine simplicity says that God is not made of parts. There is no complexity in a material or physical sense to God. God has no composition. The doctrine of divine simplicity is a direct result of God being uncaused. An uncaused being cannot be made of parts. Otherwise, that being would be caused by those parts. So it's a logical necessity that an uncaused being not be made of parts or be divinely simple. Now, this doctrine is central and fundamental to the cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Divine simplicity allows one to say that there must be this uncaused metaphysical cause who creates physical reality. Without that understanding that God is uncaused and not made of parts, then God would be a caused God. And if God is a caused God, well, then you have problems establishing any sort of philosophical proof that God exists. For instance, if God is caused, then what makes God any different than any other caused pagan god or a self-created pagan god? So you end up with the turtles all the way down atheist objection, where they say, well, who caused God? So if you have a caused God, then you can rightly ask the question, who caused God? And that whatever caused God would be greater than God. And then God isn't God. It's not the supreme being. Um, if God is caused, then you're also going to have a very difficult time showing that God has any role in the universe or role in creation. God becomes superfluous. And then you can eliminate God through Occam's razor as an unnecessary assumption for physical reality. So it's important to protect the idea of divine simplicity if you're a theist. So what is this argument that atheists use to try to show that divine simplicity isn't real? Well, the most basic argument is divine simplicity, it doesn't make any sense. It's incomprehensible. How could you have something that causes the cosmos and that something not be made of parts? It doesn't make any sense. It seems impossible because it doesn't make any sense. Well, the truth is that the doctrine of divine simplicity, which says that God is not made of parts, is really saying that God is uncaused. And because God is uncaused, there can't be a causal explanation for God. By definition, you can't be uncaused and also have a causal explanation for your existence. That's a direct contradiction. So anything that's uncaused would have to be divinely simple. It's just It has no explanation. It can't be given an explanation by definition. So the only real question is there good reason to believe that there is an uncaused metaphysical cause for physical reality? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You can look at all the videos on the cosmological arguments and read those arguments, and they basically all focus on the necessity of an uncaused metaphysical cause. So something's got to be uncaused. Uh, However, that uncaused thing cannot be made of parts. Otherwise, it would be caused by its parts. So, simple fact of the matter is something has to be uncaused, or none of us would be here. But the truth is that an uncaused thing is not made of parts, which means it has no causal explanation that anybody could give or figure out. It has no internal workings of any sort, any parts of any sort that one could use as an explanation for its existence. So it's inexplicable by definition. So God is inexplicable by definition. At least the divine simplicity of God is inexplicable. And there is no way to understand or comprehend the inexplicable by definition. You can't do it. It's just a brute fact that the uncaused is inexplicable by definition. So, because the uncaused metaphysical cause has no causal explanation that it can give by definition, then the atheist will say, aha, well, that means you can't know God. God is unknowable. And therefore, any attributes or God's nature that you subscribe to God can't possibly be correct because you can't know God. You can't understand divine simplicity. It's inexplicable by definition. Therefore, there is no way to know God. God is unknowable. So the atheist will take this conclusion that God is unknowable, that you can't know the nature of God or God's attributes, and use that to prove that everything you understand to be God can't possibly be proven as true, and therefore you can't possibly, the God that you think of can't possibly be God, because you can't know God. So how do you know you're right? And if you can't know God the way you conceive of God, that conception of God must not exist if divine simplicity is true. So the atheist will catch you in a trap. So you either admit that God is unknowable if you stick with divine simplicity, and consequently you're stuck with the idea that anything you know about God can't possibly be proven as real because you can't know or explain divine simplicity or know divine simplicity by definition. Or if you give up on divine simplicity, then the atheist gets you because now you're talking about a caused God. And once you have a caused God, that means something caused God, which is greater than God. And poof, God disappears under Occam's razor. So this is a catch-22 argument by the atheist. Uh, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. So what do you do about this argument? Well, do not concede that divine simplicity is false. That is a huge mistake. Uh, Never concede that God is caused. Stick with divine simplicity. So, how do you get out of this argument that God is unknowable because divine simplicity has no explanation by definition? Well, the way out of it is quite simple. While it's true, you can't understand a divinely simple, uncaused thing uh, not made of parts. You don't need to in order to know God. You can know God based on two other things. You can know God based on what God tells you about God and God's will, and what God shows you in the physical universe or in physical reality. So there are two ways to know about God without having to derive a single thing from divine simplicity itself. So we can know God through two things. God can tell us things and God can show us things. That makes God knowable. Now, how can God tell us things? Well, the answer is this. Because God is the creator of physical reality, that means God must have certain attributes. We call them the three omnis, or omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence. Meaning omnipresence, God is everywhere. Omniscience, meaning God knows everything. Omnipresence, or omnipotence, meaning God is all powerful, has all powers that are real and not illusory. So a God with those attributes, who must have those attributes in order to create physical reality, is literally in control of physical reality at every moment of physical reality. He creates physical reality and sustains or conserves physical reality at every moment of physical reality. So that means he's in control of everything, every atom, every quark, every energy packet in the universe is under God's constant direct control. And that includes everything that's going inside your brain. So God is present in your brain. And God can, through omnipresence and omnipotence and omniscience, communicate with you in your brain, directly with you. Um, this is what we call a personal experience with God. God has other ways of telling us things as well, if not through people, through the behavior or the actions of other objects or even animals or things. That's conceivable since God is everywhere in the universe and has control of everything and knows everything. So, uh, what God tells us. This is usually in the form of what God has told uh, a prophet or the Son of God, Jesus. So God is speaking to them directly, and they are telling us what God has to say. Is this logically possible? Absolutely. However, it's often a matter of faith as to whether you believe that that person actually is a prophet or is the Son of God telling you what God says or what God's will is. The other way is God can show us. So we can look at the physical reality, the behavior of the cosmos, and use that as circumstantial evidence to derive certain attributes about God. The cosmological arguments are circumstantial evidence based on the behavior of physical reality, which tells us some things about God. And The basic attributes of God can all be shown or known through either of these two methods. Now, if you look at the cosmological argument, the argument from possibility, it explains how God must be intelligent and, in fact, has the greatest intelligence possible. Well, the God who has the greatest intelligence possible is surely capable of understanding human beings and understanding the human perspective. So that sort of God can certainly communicate with human beings so that human beings can understand what God is saying. So uh, the most intelligent being there is can certainly communicate with a human being and understand a human being. Now, that doesn't mean that God's experience is the same as that as a human being. It can't be, because God is the most intelligent thing there is. But God certainly can lower himself to our level and explain things to us, because he's the most intelligent being in reality. So clearly he can do that and communicate with us. All right, so there's a list of attributes of God, and I'll explain to you how it is that we can know that these things are true. So we have omnibenevolence, that is, an all-loving God. This is a characteristic of God that has been told to us by specifically Jesus. So, if you have faith that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God, backed up by the proof of resurrection, you can believe that God is omnibenevolent. So, this is an instance where God told us this was his nature. Now, there's omnipotence, meaning God has all real powers that aren't illusory, all powerful, all real powers, has all real powers. Well, we can know this based on the cosmological arguments. The circumstantial evidence of the behavior of reality, physical reality, shows us that there must be this creator of all physical reality, and that creator must have all real powers in order to create physical reality. There would be no other power that exists besides creating and conserving physical reality. So God must have omnipotence. So this would be something God shows us through circumstantial evidence. And we come to omniscience. This means God is all knowing. God knows everything. Again, this is something that God shows us. You can know this from the cosmological arguments. Specifically, look at the argument from possibility. God has to know everything about the creations of possible physical realities, because he's not made of parts. Therefore, he must have knowledge of it, the greatest intelligence possible. Therefore, he must be omniscient. So this, again, is something that God shows us via circumstantial evidence in the behavior of the cosmos. Omnipresence. God is everywhere. Well, what this really means is that God has control and conserving power over every square scrap of physical reality. And that's derived from the fact that he has the power to create and preserve or conserve or sustain physical reality. He must have that omnipresence in order to do that. There is no independently existing physical reality because God creates it and sustains it all. So this, again, something you get from cosmological argument. It's based on circumstantial evidence from the behavior of the universe. So this is something God shows us. God is immaterial. That just means God is not physical. God is not a physical reality. God is uncaused. Again, this comes from the cosmological arguments. An uncaused reality must exist, and it's God. Just look at the argument from possibility. There's a video and an explanation for it, and it'll explain why God has to be uncaused, not made of parts, and why that necessarily means he must be immaterial. So that, again, is something God shows us through cosmological arguments. God must be timeless. The reason is because God can't be subject to time, because time is something that is created, and God can't be subject to that which God creates. Not only that, time requires change, which requires parts. God is not made of parts, therefore God cannot be subject to time. So you can know this from, again, the cosmological arguments that support the doctrine of divine simplicity. So that timelessness is shown to us by circumstantial evidence. Not only that, there's also the photon, which is a timeless physical reality. So we know physical reality includes things that are timeless. Unchanging. God is unchanging. Why? Because God is not made of parts. The only way you can change is if you've got parts. So, again, this is derived from the doctrine of divine simplicity, which is shown to us by circumstantial evidence through the behavior of the universe and the cosmos as set forth in the cosmological arguments. So, again, this is something that is shown to us. God is unitary, meaning there's only one God. That, again, is shown to us through the cosmological arguments and those that support the doctrine of divine simplicity. And the reason is because there's no parts in divine simplicity. If there were two gods or more than two gods, there would be a division in divine simplicity, which means there's parts. There has to be parts if there's a division. So since there's no division or parts, then in divine simplicity, then God has to be unitary. There can only be one God. Again, this is shown to us through the cosmological arguments. God is partless. He's not made of parts. This is divine simplicity, which is shown to us through the cosmological arguments and from circumstantial evidence from the behavior of the cosmos, which proves or supports the cosmological arguments. God is good. Uh, that is told to us by uh, prophets and Jesus. So that is something that God can tell us through his son and prophets. God is existent. God exists. This is something that God shows us, again, through the cosmological arguments. There is the necessity of an uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality. It's shown to us through the circumstantial evidence of the behavior of the cosmos, which supports the cosmological arguments. God is self-identifiable. God is God and not something else. This is the identity principle. P equals P. Again, this is something God shows us through the cosmological arguments, through circumstantial evidence that an uncaused metaphysical cause must be real, and that's God. That proves that this uncaused reality is identifiable. And because that God must have the greatest intelligence possible, then God knows he's God. He has to, because he knows everything. And the fact that he exists. And referring of the term God, how do we know that we can even talk about God, right? Well, again, the cosmological arguments prove that there is this uncaused metaphysical cause that has the greatest intelligence possible, that knows that it's God, and that, as Aquinas famously put at the end of all of his arguments, all men know as God. Okay, so I hope I addressed that atheistic objection for you and that you learned something. Just understand that God is knowable through other means than simply understanding what divine simplicity means, because you can't understand divine simplicity by definition, because it doesn't consist of parts. There's no causal explanation you can give for divine simplicity, but you still can know about God based on what God tells us and what God shows us about God and God's will for mankind. And because God is the most intelligent being that exists, God can certainly understand human perspective and human beings and can communicate with us in a fashion that we would understand, and that he can tell us what he wants us to think about him in particular. All right, take care.